Welcome to Simply Sarah. I'm Sarah Stockham, your host, and I am so pleased that you are investing in yourself. Every single time that we have a conversation with somebody, these conversations are about sharing with you energetic tools. I am over the moon today, just already expanded in my energy to have Jeff here with us. Jeff, Sarah, thank you so much for uh, putting time on your calendar to come and share with the audience who you are and what you do. How did you get to where you are today, friend?
Thanks so much for having me, Sarah. It's always been a pleasure to be in your energy, whether it's in conversations, in emails, and messages. It's a delight to be in your presence. So thank you again for having me. And you said that how did I come to be and get to where I am?
Yes. What's the story?
Yeah, there's been a lot of just life that has led me to where I am.
Mm,
Um, I think each step of my journey has been a key component into leading me to where I am, where it wasn't always as it is today. Starting out growing up, I'm Japanese American, so growing up with the culture and kind of the way that I was taught things, it was an interesting balance between being Japanese and then being American.
yes.
Um, there's a heavy consideration of others instilled in the Japanese culture to be conscious of, what others' needs are, what they're
Yes.
feeling or sensing, or what's going on around you, and almost prioritizing that. So, respect for your elders, taking care of the people next to you, and then kind of you come last.
Right.
And then growing up in Western society, it's much different where if you're not putting yourself first, then no one else is.
Yeah.
Um, and so finding the balance between those two aspects of life and growing up in the area I did, I personally wasn't surrounded by a lot of Japanese Americans.
Mm,
And so it was kind of a confusing identity issue for me growing up, where it was like the common, I guess, categories were, I guess, in my mind, or how people saw me or labeled me was more as Chinese. And I'm
mm,
like, okay, well, I know I'm not Chinese, I'm
right.
Japanese. And
Right.
then
Huge
trying to
difference.
understand, yeah, like what that meant when it's like, well, you're Asian. And I'm like, so I'm Japanese and I'm Asian? Like, how am I both of those things? And then
Right.
learning about like the countries and then the continents. And so just trying to wrap my head around those things. Um, and then also growing up in the environment I was in, I spent most of my time around Vietnamese Americans.
Mhm.
And what was interesting is no matter where I went or who I was around, I kind of didn't always fully fit in. Where when I was around Japanese nationals, it was like I don't speak their language, I don't fully understand everything. When I'm
Mm,
around other Japanese Americans, I felt out of place because I wasn't in that space or kind of growing up around them. And then in the other cultures I spent time with, I was also kind of unfamiliar because I didn't identify with it in terms of like the blood.
right.
Um, so there was a lot of confusion kind of growing up and learning about this aspect of myself and learning about my identity. Um, and then, yeah, just growing up in life and learning to kind of pick the best of both worlds and combine that into who I am and how I do things.
Mhm.
And so, really merging the ability to be considerate and empathetic towards others and
Yes.
also prioritizing myself to make sure my cup is full, and
Yes.
learning to do all those things. And that journey to get there was rather difficult, being pulled in kind of different ways or different directions where
Mhm.
family, and not even just my parents but like my extended family operates in a certain way.
Yes.
And what I've come to see is like my aunts and uncles, they're all extremely considerate of each other, and almost to a fault though, where everyone is so caring about others, they end up putting themselves last, to where they then suffer from, exhaustion or burnout or all these other things. And I'm seeing the pattern and I'm like, oh, this is because we're not taking care of ourselves. And if we were to do that, then that makes it easier for anyone else around us, where it's like they don't have to worry about us, but we're also worried about each other. And it's this
Yes.
funny kind of cyclical thing.
Yes.
Um, and then realizing and seeing how that's a pattern that also is something in Japan. Um, the Japanese work ethic is crazy, so
It's
it
amazingly.
causes, yeah, like the mental health problems I feel like stem primarily from the stress from work. And in Japan, I feel like the conversation around mental health and prioritization of self isn't one that's prevalent, or as there's not as much awareness as there is here in the United States, especially right now. And so, one of my intentions is to bring that type of work and the self development side of things to Japan. One way to kind of create that or bridge that gap is through the work I do as a Reiki practitioner. And so, really taking a look at the whole individual, mind, body, spirit, all encompassing, and not just one area where, someone may go to their primary care physician for their physical health, and then a psychologist for their mental health, and then a dietitian for what they're ingesting. And it's like they're all key components, but they're not communicating with each other. And
Right.
so we're thinking of these things compartmentalized. It's like, well, my physical health is okay, so my mental health is something different, and not realizing that they do go hand in hand. And so the work that I do as a self development sensei and a Reiki practitioner is combining and having somebody look at the full picture
Mm,
and developing higher levels of self awareness and self mastery to understand, oh, how I'm doing one thing is affecting another area of my life. And there's these patterns that exist within us. Um, and then being able to really have people understand themselves and what their body's constantly communicating with them.
yeah.
I think, as entrepreneurs, we're also in this other mode of, the hustle culture. And it's like, let
Yes.
me let me turn down my needs because I need to do all the things. And then it's like, okay, so why am I always exhausted? And then my energy's low, or these other things are happening. It's taking a look at how it's all being affected by the way that we operate, which stems from how our mind is working.
Mm,
Um, and so a lot of that really stemmed from my own journey and my own lessons of learning those things, going through the struggle of it, and being aware of and becoming conscious of certain aspects of, oh, this is something I didn't realize until you realize it. And then there's that
yeah.
moment when it's, you can't unknow it. Um, and that's great too. So
Yes.
that's been a brief overview of my journey so far.
Oh, I absolutely love the story. And there's so many parts in there that I completely identify with, having grown up in a African culture, my parents
Yeah.
working there and looking different, and yet feeling very much at home in some respects with the customs and the respect of elders and expectations inside that particular tribe in that particular area, and then coming to the States and looking like I'm supposed to fit in but having really no cultural understanding. And we'd spend 4 years in Africa and then come back and spend a year here. My parents were educators. They wanted us to have a complete year of education here in the States. And each time that we came back to a different place. Not even the same state, not the same city. We'd always go see relatives that, stayed in the same areas. But every time that we moved, we came back for the year. We would come back for a different place for my parents for their education. Both of them had their masters and they were working on other pieces and things as well. So, such an incredible connection. As you were speaking, I was like, oh, I identify with that. I identify with that. I have been in rooms where I should feel for myself like this should be an easy conversation, and yet found myself really kind of processing through areas that were similar and areas that were different, and looking for those places of self identity. Who am I? Inside of this culture, inside of this very loving group that's respectful and caring for each other. But how do I, because I had blonde hair, I was so different, Jeff. I was a towhead, right? And so even from the other siblings,
Wow.
just looked so different. And then had a cleft lip on top of that. So I really stood out. And so how did I, learn those tools of how to fit in a room, and to be listening internally to what's taking place and how our body really does speak to us about how we feel comfortable or that we feel cared for, and what we are doing in the space of doing that. So we're going to get a super quick commercial break. We're going to come back, and I would love for you to share when we come back some of the tools that you began to use as you began to figure out this integration and listening internally to the powerful, amazing, beautiful person that you are. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Simply Sarah. And I just want to share that the person who owns Field Trip is somebody who's also walked a very similar line or a similar space that Jeff and I have. And so as we're continuing this conversation, I'm asking Jeff the tools or some of the things that you began to use to be able to find your voice and then to become a sensei in who you are.
Whew. It's been it's been a journey of self-discovery
Mhm.
to undo a lot of the conditioning of what I felt was, I guess, right, or what was taught. Like these are the ways it needs to be,
Mhm.
and taking a look at what felt aligned to me, what was my truth, not what was somebody else's. Um, and that was difficult because for most of my life, I think feeling like that outsider or that outcast, it was a lot of trying to blend in, trying to fit in,
Yes.
trying to fit the square peg into the round hole.
Yes.
And in doing all of that, losing myself.
Mhm.
Um, and so the journey became really finding myself. Um, and that looked completely different than what I was used to. And I think a good catalyst for that was actually during 2020 with COVID.
Mhm.
And because of the lockdowns and the isolation, it allowed me to spend more time alone.
Yes.
Um, one of my kind of coping mechanisms and ways of avoiding the things that were happening internally for me was to look external. And so rather than be alone with my thoughts, my feelings, I would surround myself with people. So during school, when I was in like high school, junior high, AOL Instant Messenger was a thing and coming out, and so you'd be able to chat with people online, and I would always procrastinate from doing my homework by talking to other people. And then, most of my life, I grew up at home with my parents, and then when I went away, I lived in San Diego for a period of time, going to college down there, and I had roommates the whole time. Then when I moved back to San Jose, where I grew up, I moved in with roommates again and continued that pattern of always just living with other people. And so right before 2020, in a house that had 4 bedrooms, there were 4 couples living here. So any given time everyone was home, there were 8 people here.
Right.
And I cultivated that for myself so I would never be alone.
Yes.
And it gave me that sense of security or belonging even, just because there was people around. And
Yes.
so that shift during COVID, we were all pent up in the house, and then slowly, gradually, people moved out because we were just, it was a lot to be in each other's space, that many people all at once. And so I ended up finding myself, there was only a couple roommates left, and then it dwindled out to one. And then it was like, oh, everyone moved out, and I'm here alone. And it was almost like the forced opportunity to spend that time alone where I wasn't being influenced by anyone else, whether it
Yes.
was in my thoughts, my emotions. I'm also highly empathetic. There was a period of time when I didn't realize or recognize that, and I was just picking up energy and vibrations and things from others. And
Yes.
so being in that space of spending time alone, it was like, oh, this is who I am without anything kind of diluting that, without any other influence, without anything external.
Yes.
Um, and then, yeah, a lot of the discomfort around that of spending time alone with my thoughts, meditating, learning about like, oh, when no one else is around, this is what I enjoy doing, or this is what I like to be spending my time with, or all of those
Yes.
things that I never really experienced because I had avoided it.
Yes.
Um, And so one of the tools that has supported me was to isolate.
Mm-hmm.
And again, well, not again, but for every individual, I find that the tools, the advice, and all of the things, it's not a one size fits all. And so for
So
me as
true.
an individual that loves to be around other people, it was a coping mechanism. I tend to be social, but there's also times when I'm more introverted.
Mm-hmm.
For me, spending time alone was the stretch or the challenge
Yeah.
that was a tool that became useful for me. Versus somebody else who typically gravitates toward that and enjoys that, then what may support them is to spend more time and be more, um, not external, more extroverted. And
Yes.
so that is a tool for me to spend time alone, to be
Mm-hmm.
aware of, okay, what is my energy saying? What is true and authentic to me?
Yeah.
And then being able to learn that about myself then taught me empathetically and energetically what isn't mine. So now when I step into public
Yes.
spaces and I get these feelings or sensations that overwhelm me, it's like, okay, that's
Mm-hmm.
not mine.
Right.
I'm picking that up. And so I get
Yes.
to release it. And that's been a great supportive tool for me to understand myself and what's authentic. And as I become that and step into that, it allows me to then really be more in my power. There's
Yes.
less fear of judgment. There's less fear of rejection because then I realize and recognize that every individual is a unique person with their own preferences and all those things. And so when I don't align to somebody, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with me or that I'm being rejected in a negative way. It just means that it's not a good fit and that's okay. My value isn't tied to one individual's opinion of that.
Yes.
And that's been another great tool to really be able to understand and
Mhm.
separate my value from not having to people please everyone around me.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, those are several kind of main key tools that I use and recognize that there's been a lot of benefit from.
Yeah. Jeff, I just want to pick up on what you said about the piece of isolation. We hear that word, and there can be a very negative connotation that comes along with it. And yet, if we think about people who've been on spiritual journeys, that people have for centuries chosen to take time away in order to listen differently, in order to process things differently. And like you, for me, the shutdown was one of those places. But as you were
Mm,
sharing that, I began to think back to the first time that I began as in my teaching career, began to really pull back. And I had been teaching at that point for about 12 years. And once you teach something for 5 times through, you have a really good grasp of what you are educating, what you are teaching. And so at that point, then you can start to see modules and move them around differently and know that you'll get to where you need to be. And as a classroom teacher, I had been doing that now for a number of years. I'd changed grades a couple different times and was in the grade that I thought that I would finish my career in. It didn't end up being that way. But in this particular grade change, I'd been into it for a couple years. And every day at lunchtime, the teachers would all go to the lunchroom and we'd all eat together. And I began to recognize in my life that if I wanted some things to change in my life, that I needed to change. And I began looking for places and time to be able to read, to be able to listen to cassettes. I'm dating myself saying that. And then some things were later on DVDs or CDs. And then have time to kind of process and to listen to these ideas and just a chance to kind of listen internally. And I made the decision that I would not go to the lunchroom with the other teachers Monday through Thursday, but then on Friday we would all be together. And I remember somebody that I have great admiration for coming to my door just saying, I'm coming to check on you to make sure that you're okay, that you're not coming to lunch every day. And I just shared kind of sheepishly what I was working on. She was very supportive of it. But I began to notice that my language in the classroom began to become much more authentically mine just by 4 days a week choosing to eat alone. And that how I saw the students at my grade level became very, very different as well. And in that time, I became the most, I don't say this as a bragging point, just as when we're authentically ourselves, things change. I
yeah.
began to be the teacher who was the most sought out at that grade level at that school, because what I was doing was authentically from the inside coming out, right? And so taking these spaces and times, whether it happens to be a 30-minute lunch that we devote to listening internally, or it happens to be something that's much more external, like a shutdown. But in these spaces of being able to pull away, to be able to listen, to be able to be fearless, or at least have some courage in the face of what happens when things come up. Because my first thought in the shutdown was, this is a lot of alone time. This is a lot of quiet space. And we had somebody who was sheltering in place with us. Our adult daughter was home. Husband was there, but he was working and had been working online. So for him, it was different having other people around. And we lived on property that was large enough that we could all have our own space inside and also outside. Definitely a privilege and a blessing, especially for that period of time. I love what you were sharing about this unraveling, this being willing to look at and contemplate and not throw out the relationships, because I know that you and your father have an incredible relationship now, right? So that you weren't repelling his authority or his place of wisdom in your life or place of community in your life, but that you are taking this space inside of yourself to say, who am I? Yes, in relationship and connection with, but who am I? And what does this look like and feel like? Did you find yourself journaling like a lot of people do, or did you find other ways of processing through the information?
Yeah, I'm not a big journaler, so there wasn't a lot of journaling. It was, I think, a lot of my reflection or my integration is through conversation. So I
Yes.
think when I say something out loud and share it with someone else, that becomes kind of my way of journaling, or the effect of journaling for others is
Yes.
similar for when I have conversations.
Yes.
Um, Growing up, though, I did have a lot of resistance, especially towards my dad. I was very rebellious, and growing up and getting older, I became aware of kind of some of the things, and so one of the struggles I had as I began my own self development journey was the resistance I had to recognizing that I had, I guess, parental trauma,
Mhm.
in the way that I would compare myself and my situation to others. So I grew up in a very loving home. My parents cared for me; they took care of me. It wasn't There wasn't any abuse, there wasn't any like violence or anything. And so in my mind, I'm like, no, I don't have any childhood wounds. But because of that, it prevented me from looking in that area, in that space, to
Mhm.
realize that for me it was a unique situation where there was abandonment sensations or feelings from my dad going to work and traveling a lot,
Yes.
and that having an effect on me, and realizing that part of my self-worth conversation was tied to that, to
Mhm.
realize that in my mind subconsciously as a kid I realized or formed the idea or the story that work and career is more important than I am. And
Right.
then that also became like work and money is more important than I am. So
Mhm.
then there's that disconnect in my self worth and my ability to um, recognize my value. And so
Mhm.
as an entrepreneur, that was something I had to work through, because it's,
Mhm.
I'm 100% responsible for every aspect of my business,
Right.
including the ways that I spend my time and what I charge for that.
Mhm.
And having struggled with that conversation of self worth and realizing the disconnect between my value and worth, and finances was like that didn't support me, so I had to balance the scales and realize where it originated from. And there
Mhm.
was resistance to that because I have a very loving relationship with my parents, but
Yes.
resistance to look there, to almost kind of, and again, this is the cultural aspect of like not going against or disrespecting your parents,
Right.
which, as rebellious as I was, it wasn't ever the intention to be like, well, this is your fault, and you did this to me.
Right.
And there was
Right.
also a lot of empathy to be like, that wasn't their intention. They were doing what
Yeah.
they thought was best and what served what was in the moment. And having compassion for myself to recognize, yeah, this did have a negative effect on me,
Yeah.
not through their intention, but it was still something I had to acknowledge so that I could work through it.
Yeah.
Um, and so what I had found, another great tool or something that I always keep in mind, is the balance of things.
Mhm.
So life, we're almost taught, is very black and white, right? Like our laws, they're black and white. This is right, this is wrong.
Yeah.
The reality though is everything is gray. There's
Yes.
people that do terrible things for the right reasons and people that do great things for the wrong reasons.
Right.
And with, the situations in here, it's, the polarity or the duality of it, where yeah, they raised me and they loved me in the way that they thought was best, and sometimes that had a negative effect.
Yes.
My dad wanted to provide for the family because him growing up, his family struggled financially, so he never wanted that for us. And so
Right.
he invested himself heavily into work so that that wouldn't be our experience. And in doing so, he created that for us, but also created a different experience for me, where then there was other conversations my subconscious was having. And so
Yes.
realizing that both can be true, where like, yeah, I grew up in a loving, caring environment, and there were still things that, as a child, that my needs weren't being met in some shape or form, not
Yeah.
because I was being neglected, but just simply because that was the reality of my experience.
Mm.
And so not putting blame on anyone external from myself, but just recognizing
Yes.
the thing. And that takes so much like awareness, and there's this gymnastics you mentally
Yes.
do to navigate all of that and
Yes.
maintain that balance. Yeah.
This conversation is so liberating for me and so healing. As every conversation and interaction with you has been, Jeff. My parents also, very, very loving home. And yes, we did move around, and there was this disconnect at points with that. But when we were here in the States, there was a ton of traveling that my dad would do for lots of
Mm,
different reasons. And it felt like the mass, the big, was so much more important than the small. And for me, it has been the relearning that it's the little things that I choose to do every day that have the bigger impact on things, right? And so if I want to make a big impact, it's not about the big, it's about the little tiny. And it is mental gymnastics in that space of working through and figuring out that we can be empathetic, caring great love and care for other people, and we can choose to do that for ourselves and with ourselves. And in that space of being able to uh, hold both dualities and give ourselves the permission to be open to optimal, and knowing that the optimal can be in conversations with our parents, but also optimal can be in conversations with ourselves.
yeah. Yeah. Like having that same compassion we have for others also inward. And
Yes.
that's something that's also difficult sometimes.
Mhm.
Especially, yeah, for I think a lot of Japanese Americans in my experience. It's like it's so easy for us to praise others, but the moment someone praises us, there's almost this resistance and rejection. Like, no, no, no.
Right.
Like the over humbleness becomes negative self talk.
And it's almost a physical moving out of the way, right?
Yeah.
But I have noticed several different times in saying to somebody, I'm just so grateful you're doing this so incredibly well. And physically moving out of the way and saying, no, 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 and putting the hand there where the person used to be, to kind of shake it off and say that I'm not allowed. And I think that when we hear compliments that are given to us in truth, that whether or not we agree with them, to be able to be in that person's presence and allow them to say the loving, encouraging praise that they are, because that for them might even be a growth point, right?
Hmm.
And to allow it just to be, and then to decide later on how much of that you identify with or not, or maybe even in that moment, if I'm processing that fast, to be able to take it in and see, because sometimes people will give compliments and see an aspect of who you are that maybe you hadn't even recognized before, or it's just such a, of course I'm like that. Why would anybody, this is just who I am, rather than seeing that it's a real unique and precious gift that you are, and it's an aspect of who you are. Hmm.
This makes me think of are you familiar with the book The Four Agreements?
Yes, tell me more. Tell the
I'm
audience
trying
more.
I'm
Yes.
trying to remember one of them, but one of them has to do with this, where it's again the balance of not letting someone else's opinion or experience of you affect you either way,
Right.
whether it's positive or negative, because it's almost neutral. Like they
Right.
get to share their experience of you, and you get to receive that, good or bad, and then not let it affect your ego or your pride.
Mhm.
And I can't remember which of the four agreements it is. Do you know? It's gonna bug me.
I yes, and I can see them written out on my office wall from when I was teaching, and I can't pull it out. I'm sorry, but yes, that is that space of neutrality, and that when somebody, if the work that I'm doing at my best and highest, somebody sharing with me, either that they like it or don't like it, is information. I'm the person who gets to decide the judgment of that. And if I can, for a moment, pull the judgment piece out and look at the information as information, that is what helps move me forward into what do I do with this? Is this information worth using or not?
Yeah, I found it. I googled it real quick.
Good. Thank you.
The four agreements are: be impeccable with your word. The one we're referring to is don't take anything personally. And
Yes.
it's nothing others do is because of you. What others say and do is a result of their own dream or perception of their rules. We
Right.
all make rules about how things should be, but when you are immune to the opinions and
Mhm.
actions of others, you won't be the victim of needless suffering.
Mhm.
And then the other two are don't make assumptions and then always do your best.
Always. Always. Yes.
And then
And
yeah,
our, go ahead.
your best changes. So my
Yes.
best today could be different from my best tomorrow, and it's that compassion and that grace. And again, it's all balance.
Right. And I have to share with you that I was introduced to yoga during the shutdown with somebody who had also grown up overseas, but had been there right after I had graduated from high school. So I hadn't known her then, although the
Okay.
family knew her. And then she came to our house when parents were visiting and met her. So then shutdown happens, and she immediately figures out Zoom and says, let's all do this together, and has a community around the world doing yoga together. And she would say things like, every day is different. And I would be like, yeah, I get it. But what she was saying to us, and we've had conversations more recently about this, is that every day our body is different. And I just didn't see that. I don't know why I was blind to that, Jeff, but I was. And when I began to really look at myself and look at my face and see that some days I'm more hydrated, what that looks like, and some days I'm not as hydrated, what that looks like, and beginning to see that every day my body is different, that gave me permission to be able to see that every day I was showing up differently as well. I knew it, I didn't know it. And that was really an incredible experience. And maybe because because I have been so empathic, I wasn't necessarily so somatic. And as I begin to continue to put those pieces together, I'm beginning to see things differently as well.
I love what you just said. Because I was so empathetic, I was less somatic. And that has been one of the struggles and an area of elevation for me, where I am working with somebody in somatic work and connecting more to my body, because being in the head disconnects you from that. And I live
Right.
there heavily.
Yes, yes. And I think that people also who work in multiple languages find it easier to live there. Um, that's just an observation that I've been making, and I'll leave it at that. So, you've been sharing some of the tools that you have been using as you have been uh, moving into this place of truly being a sensei. I invite you to share for people who are listening in who are not as familiar with the Japanese customs. What is a sensei, and why is that title such a revered title?
Yeah. It is, Sensei is a teacher or somebody that can guide. Um, and I think it's different than a coach. I feel like a
Very.
coach is somebody that is more of maybe, and this is not, yeah, this is not the truth. This is just my experience of it or my opinion of it. But a coach is somebody that is kind of on the sidelines telling you like, hey, um, give this a try, or giving
Right.
consulting or giving advice from the sidelines. Whereas my intention with being a sensei is more of walking the journey either alongside you or one step ahead.
Right.
um, to be, hey, this is not something you're doing alone.
Hmm.
This is the proof in that someone else has also done the thing.
Yes.
And so really the audience I speak to and the people that I end up working with are people that resonate with where I've been. And
Yes.
again, that's typically people that are just that one step behind, where it's like, hey, this is one way to do it. You don't have to follow. You can
Right.
also carve your own path. And that's one of the
Yes.
things that I love, is the flexibility, where
Hmm.
my preference is really to be walking one step behind the people I work with and letting them lead and carve their own path, and just making sure that they're held in a way that, um, if you stumble and fall, I'm there to help pick you back up.
Yes.
If you veer off the path, it's kind of the bumpers to be like, hey, is this the direction you want to be going, or is over here kind of more aligned to what you're really moving towards? Um, and so in that way, I think the Sensei title for me is a way to continue to remind others that the work we're doing is really in collaboration.
Yes.
um, I'm not doing the work for an individual. I'm
Right.
supporting them in the experiences that I've had. Like, this
Hmm.
is what worked for me, so find that same thing for you. It
Right.
doesn't need to look the same as it does for me, but this is an example.
Mhm.
Here's what I've done that worked for me. Um, yeah.
For me, the word sensei also is I am in life. I am doing life. And I'm not going to come to you in a business suit and give you 6 easy steps to be able to do X, right? But that I am so authentic in what I'm doing that I'm going to be sharing with you what has worked, what hasn't worked. And I'm not going to make the what hasn't worked, I'm not going to gloss over that. I'm going to allow you to lead the conversation, but I'm willing to go deep. Um, and I'm not knocking the 6 easy steps to be able to do, although in my voice you would say differently, because there are, when you make a cake, there are 6 steps that you do to make the cake. And so there are definitely places where that is the way to do it. And when I was a mentor teacher teaching new teachers, there were definitely steps that we said, these are the things that you need to do to make your administrator happy. But I think that the work about a sensei or with a wise woman coming into helping somebody, right? These concepts that we have of people who have been walking life, that they're looking at it with a broader scope and that they're looking at it with the full life, not just a skill or one particular area of life. Would you agree with that, or what would you want to? I'm saying this out loud for the first time and kind of wondering if that really is how it lands.
It's so interesting, because there's, like you're saying, right, there's all these different facets and aspects
Mhm.
of what it is that we do. And so that's personally what I bring to the table. It's
Yes.
not, okay, I graduated from this coaching program, and so now I'm going to be a coach.
Right.
That's one aspect of it, on top of any mentor I've had, on top of any transformational work I've done, on top of any spiritual awakenings I've gone through, on top of any meditations I've done, on
Yes.
top of the people I've connected with, and all the things I've learned in my journey to become the individual that I am.
Mhm.
And then using all of that experience, knowledge, and information to pass that on to anyone that I work with. Um,
Yes.
and it is looking at things from a combination of that 1,000-foot view
Mhm.
of the bigger picture, and then also under the microscope to say, okay, here is an area of focus that, this one experience I had speaks directly to this, but also
Yes.
from the lens of everything else that I've experienced in life, to be like, and this may go against what I just said 10 seconds ago, but this is also relevant to your experience, and that's going to support you in making a decision or moving in a direction. Um, and it's pulling from all those parts of our experience, and then also being authentic. So, what
Yes.
I really strive to do, and also still struggle to do because of my own ego, is to show up in both the good and the bad.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I try my best to celebrate my wins publicly, and also the things that I struggle with.
Yes.
And sometimes the response I get is interesting. It's a mixed bag. Some
Yes.
people will reach out and be like, "Hey, I'm just checking in because I saw you posted this video and it seemed like you were going through a hard time." And it was just like, "Oh yeah, that was several days ago, and that was just my experience that day. Like I'm
Yes.
overall I'm okay. It was just I want to share that to be authentic, to give
Yes.
people that permission." And it's also part of the journey, right? I
Mhm.
don't want to paint this picture of like this perfection and suit and tie and I have it all figured out. It's like, yeah, I'm going through the journey as I'm sharing and teaching others about the journey as well. It's not something that has been perfected, because life is not perfect and no human being is perfect. We're a
Right.
constant work in progress and the work never ends.
Yes.
So conveying that is also something that I strive to do. And again, my ego gets in the way sometimes. Like, oh, can I
Mhm.
say this in public or out loud or make a post about this?
Right. Right. I think coming back to the sensei word or continuing on that conversation, to me, rather than it being a competition or encouraging the person that we're working with or that you would be working with in the spirit of competition, it's the spirit of collaboration. It's the spirit of contribution. It's the spirit of openness. It's the spirit of an open hand of this is information, do with it as you wish. And you are
Absolutely.
the person who is doing the work is the one who's accountable for using the tools and using the information.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And it's not a competition with my clients to be like I have to prove that I'm better than you or I know more. It's like, no, like we're both human beings. And if
Yes.
you resonate with the things I've experienced and the way that I articulate and it can support you, then let's
Yes.
collaborate in that. Let's share what your goal is and find solutions that work for you. Not here's my way and do it my way because I'm right and you're wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. So, Jeff, if you were going to give advice to somebody who is a generation behind you, who is Japanese American, who's living in an area where they're the only person who is Japanese American potentially at their school, that people are, you know, calling them Chinese, calling them Asian, working through those kinds of pieces, what advice would you give that person who is noticing that they don't necessarily fit in, but that they are definitely where they are in school in terms of learning? What advice would you share with them?
Hmm. Yeah, to take intentional time alone and
Mm,
to learn about who they are, what their core values are, and maybe starting with the opposite, to look at what the belief system they carry is and what's been instilled in them externally. What was taught to us in school, what was taught to us by our parents, what was taught to us in our friend circle, who we spend the most time around is like the five people we spend the most time with is a reflection of who we become or who we are. And so
yes.
taking a look at those things that are external and almost making a list and then looking at that list to see which parts of that are actually authentic to me or
Mm,
which of that is something that is a story that I believe is the truth,
mhm.
and then becoming able to distinguish the differences. And
Mm,
this is pretty high level and difficult
yes.
if you're stepping into like self-awareness for the first time, but
Right.
I think that is a great way to start out to really learn who you are and what is authentic to you, because that was never really a question that was asked of me. It's like, hey, what do you want? It's just do it this way or
Right.
be this, not
Yes.
what would you like or what do you think is the best or right.
Mhm.
And so learning what that is for yourself and coming up with your own answers.
Mm,
And there is an existing framework that already exists inside of us through our own conditioning. And so becoming aware of that allows us to then say, oh, is that aligned to me or is this something else?
right.
Um, so I think that's a great starting point. And then as that continues to grow and evolve, then yeah, learning to step into the four agreements and not have this fear of judgment or placing our value externally.
Yes.
So developing high levels of self-worth and self-confidence that is internal. not seeking external validation, not seeking approval from others, but providing that for ourselves,
Mhm.
validating ourselves, approving of ourselves, learning to love ourselves. And again, that's not advice I was ever given growing up. It was almost the opposite of like, don't be too cocky, don't be too arrogant,
Right.
don't toot
Yes.
your own horn. And it's like, yeah, but sometimes it's supportive to do some of those things. And again, in balance.
Yes. And also, Jeff, that it's not a straight line, right? The way that we feel today, is exactly this. And to give ourselves that grace in that process as we um, are speaking to our truth to ourselves, and to give it time, I think, is also another piece of, the self, the working internally is not a quick fix, but one that is
It's a
so
long journey.
completely worth the work.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, anything you work hard towards becomes much more rewarding, and this is exactly that, where it's a long journey that does not end. Once you uncover and work through something, it'll come up again in a different way, shape, or form, and you'll just have different tools and awareness around it, but the patterns do repeat themselves, and then you work through it quicker. But
Mm.
it's a continuous thing. There's 5 kind of steps to healing that I've learned and share with the people I work with. So awareness is the first step. Acceptance is the second. Did I lose you?
No, I'm still here, but I just want to have all of you sharing these 5 steps because this is so, so, so amazing. I should have warned you ahead of time, friend. Go ahead, start over.
So the first step to healing is awareness. The second step is acceptance. The third step is forgiveness. The fourth step is acceptance again. And then the fifth step is getting comfortable with revisiting it over and over. And so the first step of awareness is really you have to be aware that there's a problem. Or I like to correlate this example with like physical wounds. So, if I have a cut on my hand, but I don't notice it, I'm not going to stop to address the wound. But, if I'm cutting lemons and it's like, oh, that stings, I now have awareness of it. The second step is acceptance. So I could be in denial to be like, no, maybe that's not there and something else, and I'll ignore it. But once you accept that there's a problem and it needs to be addressed, then it gets a little bit easier to take the time to do so. So accepting, hey, this is a thing that happened in my past, or this is an experience I had, and I get to do some work to heal it. And then the third step of forgiveness is forgiveness all around. So when we hold on to resentment or blame, that becomes an emotional burden that we bear, and forgiveness is really a gift that we give ourselves. And so being able to forgive anyone involved in anything that we're holding on to, any traumatic event, any experience, any wound, and also forgiving ourselves. So there could be self beat up, there could be blame, there could be, oh, this is my fault because I allowed this to happen. But having that grace and compassion to forgive yourself, to say, hey, during that time, I didn't have the same knowledge and experience I have now. And in hindsight, I would have chosen differently. But during that moment, I made this decision because of X, Y, and Z, whatever was in that space at the time. So forgiving yourself for, your past, that things in the past don't define you or make up your entire being. It's a part of your journey, but it's not defining of who you are. So forgiveness of anyone involved, including yourself. The fourth step of acceptance, again, is to accept that anything we've experienced, we can't just go in and remove. It's not like, oh, I've worked through that and this is gone now. I never need to touch it and it's just removed from my history. It's like a physical scar on your body. It's always going to be there. And over time, the pain may go away, but the scar will remain. And it's not something negative to try to worry about and remove, because it also shapes who we are. Every experience I've had in this lifetime has led me to where I am now, and I don't regret any of it, because had one piece of it shifted, it would have shifted the trajectory of where I am today. So wearing them almost like a badge of honor, or accepting that they're not going away, so that you can really integrate and be self-accepting. And then that fifth step of revisiting it over and over. So again, we may want to be like, hey, this is a very traumatic thing. I don't want to think about it very often, because every time it comes up, I get uncomfortable, or these emotions come with it. Accepting that we get to revisit it in many different areas and how it correlates to different parts of ourselves and our life is a skill set and a tool. So I like to think of these things as a really annoying old friend, where it's like, oh, you're back. Like,
Yes.
oh, this is not going to be fun, but also like this is like an old friend. Like, you being here, I'm going to learn something. There's going to be growth, and
Yes.
I may not enjoy it, but accepting that as over time you just get familiar with it and you're like,
Mhm.
oh, hey, you're back. We're
Yes.
going to do some work together.
Yes.
Because we don't always correlate. It's easy to work through the obvious connections where it's like,
Mhm.
okay, this one example is directly tied to this other example,
Mhm.
but we may not realize how the dots intertwine and connect, where it's like they daisy chain together, and it's like, oh,
Yes.
that thing in my past with my career actually has to do with my romantic relationships. I never would have
Right.
thought. But if
Yes.
you pack up that box and put it away in the closet and lock the door, and you're like, I'm never touching that again because I've worked through it all,
Yeah.
then you've stunted your growth. So that fifth step of getting comfortable with revisiting it over and over supports you in your growth. Um, yeah,
For me, the space that comes quickly to mind is the space of grief. That grief daisy chains, just like you were saying, right? And grief can be hard and it can be heavy and it can be something that we don't want to look at or feel any part of it. And recently we had a massive storm come through and
your
um,
tree.
the tree, exactly, and the tree in the front yard. And for me, being able to be in that space of losing the tree and the grief of that, but realizing that my grandparents had planted the tree. And so now knowing that my aunt, who is still living at 97, when she comes for dinner next, is going to have strong emotions about that. That my siblings, my cousins, everybody, we all played with this tree, right? And so realizing anew that grief could show up when I hadn't lost a person, but it's a family grief, right? Over a tree and being willing to be in that space. And so yesterday I was taking time to talk to the stump that's still there, as I was removing some of the flowers and things that I had planted just a few months ago underneath it, but just taking the time to be present. And it was so amazing to me, Jeff, that this silver maple stump yesterday, after I began talking to it, it's been cut for days, maybe even 10. And for yesterday, the top of it began like it was weeping. It just began to get really, really wet. And there wasn't any rain in the air, there wasn't anything. But just being in that space and allowing nature to talk to me, for me to talk to nature, was a really profound allowance because I hadn't shut the door on grief.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing that. And the connection we have with nature and plants and trees is amazing, and I think one
Yes.
that isn't as often talked about. But yeah, there's videos that circulate where, especially with the root network and the mycelium and all of the
Yes,
things, like the plants are able to communicate with each other.
they are.
They can sense and feel energy, so when we
Yes.
communicate with them, they're listening. They
Yes.
can hear and feel what you're feeling. So the tree weeping makes sense to me, right? Like, it was sharing the emotion that you had,
Yes.
the loss that was being felt and grieved. And it's there's magic to it that I don't think we fully recognize or understand, or it's as widespread as I would like it to be. So
Yeah, absolutely. Ah, dear friend, our time is so precious to me. Are there things that you would like to reiterate? And as you're thinking about that, I just want to encourage anybody, if this conversation has stirred something in you, I invite you to reach out to Jeff and have a conversation with him and even to work with him. Being in his presence truly is as amazing as this conversation is. He is consistent, he is a sensei for real.
thank you. Yeah, just reiterating that, uh, to have that compassion for yourself wherever you're at in your journey, it
Yes.
to recognize, yeah, it's difficult, and there will be days that are better than others and worse than others, and that's okay. And
Yes.
to, yeah, give yourself the grace and compassion for what you need in that moment. your body is always communicating what it needs to you, and we're taught to really shut that down and not listen. So
Right.
taking the time to really tap into that and learn about yourself and what's being shared, and so that you can then live in a space that's more authentic and healthy. I think those are some great tools to continue to carry on. And it's yeah, this conversation flew by, and it's so funny because you and I are both Reiki practitioners, and I don't think we
Right.
touched on that at all in the time that we had. But
I
it's
know. So, Jeff, let's have this conversation again. I know that you're taking a group to Japan
yeah,
to as Reiki in that Reiki process, and I would love either right before or when you get back for us to have another conversation that is specifically about Reiki because it is such a vital tool to allow the full vitality of who we are to show up.
I would love that. Yeah, to schedule another session like this right after we come back from that trip would be amazing to just
Let's
share the
do that.
experience. Yeah, we
Yes,
absolutely
sounds
need to.
wonderful. Well, to our audience, thank you so much for being here. We are so grateful for you. We are grateful for you investing time in yourself to become the best version of you that you can. And know that every day is a little bit different, and that each space that we take, the steps forward, that they are worth the investment of time, the courage, the energy to do it. And I'm just so grateful for my friend Jeff coming and sharing so much with us. Have an incredible day.